Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Brett and I've got another guest today. So we're going to be talking all about CI/CD again this month, hot topic lately. And I know a lot of you have questions, so we're going to try to answer all of them because there's a lot of decisions to make when it comes to getting your code from your machine onto the servers and everything in between. So we're going to talk about that. First up, some announcements and basically how this show works. If this is the first time you're here, welcome and thanks for watching live. If you're not watching this live, show up every Thursday. I've been doing this over 2 years now. We're about to hit our 100th episode. We're going to have, we're working on some special guests for the 100th episode later this month, and you'll see some announcements about that. You can actually follow along with that and find out what's all the things that are going on in my DevOps community by supporting us on Patreon or just by following on Patreon. So real quick, over on Patreon, that's where this show basically and all the open source I'm working on and all the open content I create is all over here. You don't have to necessarily buy me a coffee every month, although I totally appreciate that. And thank you so much for those of you. Now 99 of you. It'd be great if we got to 100 today. 99 patrons are buying me a coffee every month, and I really appreciate that. We just started using Patreon this year, so it's fun to check that out. But if you just want to follow all my updates, basically all the open source I'm doing, all of the courses I'm making, all the new content, all these live shows, the podcast, the newsletter that I haven't done in a while, all that stuff, just click the follow button there on the Patreon page, and then you'll get just the notifications about what I'm doing. And you don't necessarily have to pay for that. That's a free feature. So you can use that. Second big announcement today is we're finally launching the Discord server. So for the last 3 years, 3.5 years, I have had a growing Slack community. We're now almost 33,000 people in Slack, all taking my courses or having graduated from my courses, maybe hanging out just for chat in there. And we're now going to be on a parallel platform as well as Slack. We're not leaving Slack, but Discord is, if you've been into gaming the last few years and you've seen Discord, they've been around a while. It's really I think the best community platform for live chat. It also does voice and video and streaming, so you can screen share and all that stuff. So we now have our own Discord server, and you can get that at devops.fan. That's the little new URL there at the top, devops.fan. If you just go there, you can get your invite to the Discord server, and there's exclusive roles for my Patreon fans. You can get over on that today. So we're just starting that. We've only got... I don't know how many people are on it yet, but it's certainly not 33,000 like we have on Slack. So, and we've talked about Discord several times on this show. So I haven't announced it to all the courses yet. So we haven't, but we're going to have for each course, there's going to be specific channels to chat about that course, and you'll have to be in the course to get the invite to that channel. So it has a lot of things that Slack doesn't have in terms of managing that community. So, check that out. DevOps.fan. All right, so today we're going to talk about Semaphore, and on the show, I have Marco. Hello, Marco. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Brett. Honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, and thanks for taking time out of your day. I'm guessing that it's evening there. Serbia, right? All the way from Serbia?
Yeah, Serbia, Europe. It's a good time.
All right, so I always have Europeans on the chat, and do we have anyone from Serbia? Because last week we had someone from Barcelona. We had some Spaniards on the chat. So is there anyone out there who's Serbian or a bit from Serbia? That would be, just say hello in chat. So a little bit about Marco. He is the co-founder of Semaphore, a CI/CD company. They're a software hosted platform for CI and CD. And they were lucky to... they were nice enough, rather, to invite me on their show. I was on their podcast, I think, last year, and we talked about Docker and containers. You can probably just Google Brett Fisher Semaphore to find that episode. But it's basically the same stuff we talk about here. Marco offered to be on our show, so I thought, great, let's talk more CI/CD because we can talk about this forever, like all the different choices you have to make, all the ways, and how do you get, what's the best way to get containers onto servers? How do you build your containers? In CI, how should you test your containers? Stuff like that. So we've got some more people in chat saying hello. I just thought I'd throw those in there. Belgrade and Western
Yeah, some
Canada.
people from Serbia chiming in. Cool to see.
Oh yeah, nice.
Yeah, you got
Um,
like people from San Francisco to Wuhan. So
nice. Oh, I got the 100th patron. Thank you so much. Awesome. I really appreciate it. Yeah, the whole team. There's a team behind this show, so it's nice when we're doing it every week to get a little bit of a thank you there. Austria. I was actually on the phone with someone this morning from Austria. Morocco, all sorts of cool stuff. So hello all to you out there. Thank you so much for showing up on the show live. That's what makes this great is you guys everyone out there always has great questions. And we have some really smart people that answer questions sometimes in chat. And that's always helpful too, because I don't have all the answers. So let's talk talk about your background. So you're a developer, right? So I'm taking it at some point you were like, man, CI really sucks. I need to make a company out of it to solve this problem.
that's kind of how it goes. So at the time, we had so my co-founder Darko, who was your host at our podcast, and I had a small company which was basically consultancy doing web development for tiny startups, and part of our kind of evolution and journey as software developers, was definitely adoption of test-driven development and pretty soon behavior-driven development. Because we were always kind of really cared a lot about quality and would just get pissed if we were dealing with bad code that we wrote ourselves or inherited.
Right.
And and hated testing stuff manually. That was the big one. So yeah, from the perspective of like just getting started with testing, I think if you find it intimidating to write unit tests and write tests all the time, that is intimidating at first, but you can actually start with high level acceptance tests that just kind of automate the UI, for example, so you don't have to click around. So that's how I got into it and how I caught the bug. Of course, when you have a team, kind of you reach a point where you kind of just want to automate stuff because everybody just keeps forgetting to run tests after they do some piece of work. So that was like maybe 2011, I guess. Jenkins was pretty much the only option available. So it was actually me in the company who kind of had the task to set up Jenkins for the kind of one of the client projects that we were working on at that time. The whole thing took me about more than 2 days just to get to see the tests running, and it was like on some kind of a Linode machine. It was very slow. It was kind of very obvious in the beginning that we would need like very expensive hardware actually to get anywhere close to the performance that we're getting on our machines at work. And kind of the whole user experience that I saw there with Jenkins was just felt antiquated, because we were already used to amazing products like GitHub, of course. On one hand, on the other, Heroku was around already for some time, magically just taking Git push and running your stuff in production. The industry is still catching up to that.
It's funny how long they've been around and how they're just not like. It's just funny you mentioned them because I talk a lot about them with clients because I get a lot of small clients that want to automate things and they're doing it all the hard way, right? They they're building servers manually. They don't have server admins, and so I spend a lot of my time actually trying to talk people into these. Not, I wouldn't call it serverless because that's an overloaded word, right? We use serverless for something else now, but these platforms where you don't need to build servers, right? And it's funny how that solved so many problems, but yet still so many other companies still don't do it like that. Anyway.
Yeah, that's true. I would also just recommend anybody who is unless they really have a kind of well-defined reason of not doing that, to start with a platform that takes care of as many details as possible, and then kind of evolve from there. So that's kind of the user experience that we were all, kind of familiar with, kind of being, having a taste in what in products already, because we had a kind of a failed startup before that. We kind of just saw an opportunity to create something that so instead of 2 days to set up something which is on shaky legs, to have actually a continuous integration process. I mean, we were not thinking about delivery at that time. Just can you give me a working CI process in a few minutes, please? So that was the idea that we started from. That was kind of the initial goal of Semaphore,
Yeah.
which fortunately we did launch a year from that point.
Yeah, that's cool. So I was just looking up. There was a question in chat: is the Vincent Dreisen the best Git workflow for CI/CD? And I've never heard that term, that person's name, and did not realize that was the inventor of GitFlow. So we already have some pretty technical questions right off the bat, which is good. That's our great audience out there. And it's funny because it's, Emmanuel, what is this? What does everyone call it? Vincent Dreisen's instead of just GitFlow? Like that's I
I
did
think
not
that's a
realize that.
cool. That's potentially something our industry can pursue, because there's that whole kind of debate. Are we doing, is software development of craft or engineering discipline, or
Yeah,
what is it? And I think if we start calling methods uh, by fancy names, then we will be maybe closer to physics or mathematics. Or
right, right. I'm gonna have to read this because I don't think I ever read the original. I did not realize, and I had no idea that GitFlow was a decade old as a concept. Yeah, I mean that gets a little bit more into the developer side, not so much the testing and deployment side, but it's still as GitFlow is definitely popular thing.
But I think that kind of related question that's maybe more obviously related to continuous delivery is what's the good branching strategy? And you know, mm, branch it, like some people go actually as far as saying don't branch. There's this idea of trunk-based development. So personally, I actually only realized maybe a year ago that I was using a term feature branches in a probably wrong way. So for me, like what I would say call a feature branch was, I would just git check out a branch and probably merge it in the next like half an hour. And like, what's the name of such a branch? I would just say, that's a feature branch.
Yeah,
But actually, it turns out that a lot of people, when you say feature branch, mean it's a feature that's a business is developing, and it's a work in progress, and it's probably taking months. So does that mean that your branch is active for several months? So that's, for continuous delivery, that's definitely not recommended. Better way would be to so basically all developers should merge into master every day, and that means hopefully at least once, but in the best scenario, multiple times per day. So that means just breaking things into tiny iterations, using feature flags, hiding stuff from users so that you can kind of build it up in peace on your own.
Yeah, and this is this can be done. This is sort of a huge project just to do that, right? Because a lot of companies that I work with, they're bringing me in for container implementation. But what will often happen is they'll not have the workflows or automation or infrastructure or anything set up in order to enable a developer to get code to production the same day, right? That they wrote it. And we end up spending a lot of time up front just saying, hey, look, containers, you're not going to really, containers aren't going to solve that problem inherently for you. So because a lot of times people will, they come for the containers, but they're not coming because of the tool. They're coming because they heard that this is going to improve their business productivity and resiliency and recovery and all these different things they hear about as the benefits of containers, easier development pipelines or whatever. But the reality is they need a lot of this other stuff first, right? They need a CI automation. They need ways to get code to servers. They need, these patterns, whether it's Git flow or GitHub flow or whatever workflow you want to implement. You need those practices before. Otherwise, you end up with, one developer building containers manually on their system and then pushing those manually to Docker Hub and then jumping on a server manually and then typing Docker pull. There ends up to being this whole manual process, which if you're one person and it's just a hobby, that's fine. But, teams are probably looking for more business automation and more focus on the business goals. And so I tend to shift a lot of the conversations up front with people talking about containers away from the tooling and let's talk about where you are now in terms of how fast does it take you to deploy? How often do you deploy? How fast does it take to recover? And then we work backwards from that. Do you find that to be common with your customers? I mean, you being more involved on the customer side of things now, doing less development with the software at Semaphore, are these common problems that you're helping resolve with companies?
Well, it's definitely something that I've seen as well. Most of Semaphore's customers are product organizations. So maybe just to simplify, so most of them are, more or less successful SaaS companies. Not all of them, of course. Some are building very, some really interesting and impactful open source software. Some are building enterprise stuff, but in many cases they're pretty well, on they've gone pretty far in terms of maturity level of how much they've automated things and simplified things. That's also important.
Yeah.
And even in such teams, adopting containers and going to Kubernetes is a pretty major challenge, because it's just, what does it mean to suddenly work with containers? Among other things, it's like you are taking ownership of a new abstraction layer that was not part of your process at all.
Right.
And it introduces some new steps in the delivery pipeline, which we'll probably talk about a bit later if we get to kind of discuss some details of what CI/CD pipeline, good CI/CD pipeline could look like with containers. And in such teams, it's multi-month project often, especially to get comfortable with Kubernetes and not lose. It's easy for kind of manual steps to start creeping in, and so the organizations that you're describing, it's absolutely correct in my opinion also to actually step back and kind of ask, why. Recently, I was talking to some people who actually, for example, have no automated tests at all. They've built an app which has some certain, which is gaining traction, and they think that they've decided to go from manually built VMs and just using raw EC2 and stuff to Kubernetes, because that's gonna make their application more stable. And actually, it's when there is such a case of, like, for example, having no automated tests at all, it's actually questionable. Is it really a problem in production, or the code base has already so many issues that it's not the problem is not in production, the problem is in code, and you have to start kind of from the
Right.
ground up and just start building a test suite to weed out some bugs, to give you confidence to release more frequently, to reduce time in QA, and without a safety net to change the platform on which you're deploying, it's very risky business.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think one thing that, if it isn't obvious for those listening, the more you want to automate, the more you're going to have to test, right? And I don't think that's immediately apparent to people, regardless of their maturity and how well they test and the different types of tests they do. They will get to a point. It's almost like an inevitable thing if they don't deliberately say, okay, we're going to have to implement more testing because we want to automate, and automation means less human hands, which yeah. So, and if we're going faster, like the velocity of that changes, and so a lot of times it's almost like they implement automation and new additional deployment tooling to the point that they have a failure that was due to a lack of testing. And it sort of brings back the discussion of, well, we should really improve our testing now instead of improving our deployment tooling or improving, the automation of deployments. Like we need to go back and actually make better tests so that these deployments don't have to be rolled back, don't have to fail, stuff like that. And I don't think that's necessarily obvious, because every team, first, I've never met a team that says, yeah, our testing is great, we do plenty of testing. Right? Everyone's always like, yeah, our testing could be better. We want to implement more testing, whatever. There's always a desire to improve it. And so typically I'm working with teams where we're implementing automation that I'm not quite sure they're going to know until things are actually in production, whether or not those things are going to work. Like they're not doing cross container testing, in terms of all their different services and whatnot. So
yeah, I think there's also the pool of like the path of least resistance. So change, adopting containers, for example, as a kind of way to package and deploy. It's like, at the end of the day, it's gonna be a task of one person or a few people.
yeah.
Whereas, which is like, okay, those folks out there, and even better if it's a consultant, so um, we don't worry about it. Whereas implementing a test-driven culture is basically touches on the entire engineering team, or at least the team that's building the thing that is in question. So it takes more effort, it takes more time, but there are huge dividends, because it's maybe not obvious, but it's definitely to the benefit of individual developers. Because what's the kind of how it plays out? It plays out that you end up being so confident in any new code that you write, that you can just push, you add, you make sure that the new thing that you're writing is well tested, and if the build is passing, you know, in many cases, nobody has to like, do any manual QA. You can just kind of push your work, depending on, the business or, the context. It probably means that you get to push and your code is going to reach, maybe thousands of people within minutes. And I personally think it's just like a much bigger, kind of job satisfaction there. You end up creating more. Um, the feedback loop in which you work is in a whole different level, and you're not held back by anything. Basically, you're just limited um, to your abilities, and which kind of leads you to more self-improvement and so on. So
Yeah. Well,
it adds up.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So for one of the common questions we get in the courses, and we've got some, some comments in the chat a little bit about, there's not really any great CI/CD courses out there, because a lot of the questions, I mean, yes, there's obviously needing to learn tools, but I think what would really help people, and this happens a lot with people coming out of my courses, is they have a hard time even conceptualizing all the things that need to happen between someone committing code, whether it's them or some team that they're responsible for deploying the code. They need that code to be, tested in various ways, more than just running a, npm test command or something like that. They have, questions about how these things, do I test in the containers? How do I put multiple containers together to test them? How do I get this onto my servers? So I would say a typical, let's say just if the average person showing up, they're just now learning containers. They are on a new project, so they don't have a defined existing pipeline of stuff. Like what does that look like for someone who might use something like Semaphore?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. That's the reason. That's ultimately the reason why we wrote the book, the ebook that we published a few months ago.
We should mention that too. So Semaphore has an ebook.
Yeah, it's called CI/CD with Docker and Kubernetes. It's not one of those ebooks like 20 pages, font size 24. It has about 90 pages. We wrote it for people who want like to go hands-on, but probably don't know some basics about containers, and they want to implement a CI/CD pipeline, as quickly as possible and kind of evolve from some good starting points. So as we were, talking to our own customers who, are exploring Docker and Kubernetes, we kind of realized there's no really a single resource which we could really recommend that they follow. And so we decided to create one ourselves, and hopefully it's going to be useful to a wider community. The book is free. It's also open source on GitHub, so you can ask questions and give feedback on GitHub as well.
Nice.
There's so Jerome Petasoni is a contributor. He's a huge container expert. So one of the things, the main thing that that the book builds towards is showing you how to implement CI/CD workflow with containers. So it is giving answers to these questions that you raised. So maybe I can kind of just actually share my screen and kind of show the example that the book is using, and kind of talk about some little or big decisions that are kind of made there for you as a recommendation.
Yeah. Yeah, we had a question in chat related to this a little bit. What would be a, quote, good test setup? My company is focused just on unit testing with fake data and doesn't do much, if any, end-to-end tests, and this seems backwards.
Mm-hmm. If the question is about like what kind of what's the distribution of different kinds of tests, that sort of thing. So there's a concept called a test pyramid, which if you Google it, you're gonna get probably some solid explanations. But basically, the idea is that there are different types of tests. So there are end-to-end tests that kind of test things from the user's perspective. So for example, if it's a web app, that means that the test is basically automating the interaction with your application. So it actually opens the sign up page and tries to sign up and kind of evaluates what's happening when you enter some information there. There are typically integration tests that kind of connect different subsystems of your application, but not necessarily on the user level. So maybe how some APIs work together. And on the bottom level, there are unit tests, of course, that test individual classes, methods, and so on. So the idea with the pyramid is that so the pyramid is kind of sliced horizontally. The top of the pyramid, on the top of the pyramid are end-to-end tests. So the idea is that there should be fewest of those, because just a couple of end-to-end tests are triggering a lot of basically code in your system. And on the other hand, they're very time-consuming typically, because to run an end-to-end test, you need basically to boot the entire system, database, and so on. Then kind of in the middle are integration tests. You should have some more of those than end-to-end, but you should definitely have in quantity, the biggest number should be in the unit tests, because and they should be the fastest to run. So in a CI/CD pipeline, you definitely should optimize to run unit tests first, for example, and get feedback from, for example, if they fail, that your CI build fails early and kind of doesn't go into end-to-end stuff, because a failing unit test is usually a signal of a fundamental problem that until you solve it, kind of doesn't make sense to do end-to-end integration tests.
Right.
So that's a pretty canonical way of nowadays to kind of organize your test suite and what to strive for. And I've kind of found it in our own practice to be true as well and useful.
Right. You've got some great blog entries too on the site, some great pages with some diagrams that give you some basics, especially if you're trying to figure out, where someone mentioned in chat, like where, some tooling questions, like, if you're doing Docker Compose, all these things, they all have to then be extra tools that you deal with in your CI. And that is true. I've been someone who, I love Docker Compose, and I've been using that ever since, before it was actually called Docker Compose. And that has been my traditional way to tell people to set up multiple containers that are maybe a dependency for more advanced testing. Do you still see people doing that? Is there something that, as in terms of Semaphore, when you need to cross test across containers, or when you have, is Docker Compose something that you would use? I'm not even really up on the latest like ways to test multiple containers together.
Yeah. So short answer is yes. I mean, Docker Compose is pretty much the way to, set up your whole environment and boot it, and the whole promise is it's gonna work the same way everywhere. So that's still true. So there's no better way. Generally on Semaphore, you can run containers. You don't have to. You can compose. We have some. So everything that kind of runs on Semaphore is the unit of execution is a job, and which there can be parallel jobs which make up blocks and pipelines and workflows. But essentially, we also provide a way for you to compose your own CI/CD environment as one or a combination of containers. So if we provide some default environments for Linux and macOS, for example, with a bunch of stuff pre-installed. But if you have some specific requirements, you can actually say, list the containers that your code should run in, and Semaphore will run that for you. That's not exactly Docker Compose, although it works on the same principles.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you can just kind of run Docker Compose directly in the Linux environment, for example, or macOS. And this is so what I've described is kind of two ways of booting containers on Semaphore, and it's already, there's some people are asking when to use what. And if you're already, for example, using Docker Compose in your development environment, I would just, probably advise to continue doing that in the CI/CD environment as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always interested in, basically to me, like I want every CI/CD environment to be as easy as possible. Like I don't want to have to write a ton of, in the language, whether it's YAML or JSON or TOML or some specific language for them. Like I don't want to necessarily have to get into Docker Compose if I don't have to, or it would be really great if it used the Docker Compose files and that I already probably have for local machines, and then it sort of it knows about that and is smart enough to spin up containers. Because I like the typical example I'm going to give is so a team's got a web app, right? It's they might have other things, workers and other background processes, but they have an API, they have a web front end, and then they got database and queues and stuff like that. So them just trying to understand how, like, I want to test in containers only. So that's a thing that we talk about sometimes when I have course questions from people, is that you now that you're developing for containers and you're planning on deploying containers, you want to build the containers first, and then you might do unit testing while building the container. But then your functional testing, your more advanced testing that needs multiple dependencies already set up. They're always they're not sure how to set all that up, right? And how to spin all that up the right way, the easiest way for each CI tool. So it sounds like in your case, there are ways that I can optionally not use Docker Compose if I don't want to, but if I just wanted to have it run Docker Compose commands, I could always do that.
Yes. So obviously you kind of have to start with so the non-Docker Compose way that I've described is more of a use case if you have a Docker-based environment in which you build your code. So that's not actually the environment of your application. It's more like the development environment. So yeah, it's more like it's more about using Docker Compose definitely in as part of the kind of build and test process, kind of directly
Right.
in the pipeline.
So we've got some questions in chat. One of them is, let's see, we've got something about, okay, so automation best practices for the setup of Docker files, Docker Compose. I don't have anything like that. I mean, basically the courses that I have, they teach how to build these files yourself, because those are going to be extremely specific to your environment and setup. So tools that automate that, I don't really know that exists. Marco, I don't know if you have any other additional knowledge, but I don't know of anything like that.
No, not really. It's yeah, everything that I've seen is like this is the just stuff that developers write, or that most people write and commit to Git and just maintain on their own.
Yeah. So you're gonna need those, I mean, locally anyway before you get into CI. So I mean, I have seen attempts at people writing tools that will actually look at your code, look at like your package JSON and other things, and then write a boilerplate Docker file for you. But no teams that I have ever worked with ever end up using those in production, because by the time that they've changed it to be what they really need, especially when it starts talking about multi-stage Docker builds and all the more modern advancements to Docker files and Compose files, it's always end up being so different than what those automated tools did for them that there was no point in really using that tool, other than just to maybe check a box and say, yes, it now works in Docker, but it doesn't mean that's what you're going to use.
Yeah, I guess if maybe maybe a tool that just gives you some starting points could be useful to beginners, just like boilerplates. Maybe that's where the question is coming from.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, there's nothing that's really so advanced that you can kind of produce something that's good enough for production.
Yeah. That's what I figured. The next question here from Owen. What do you think the major stumbling blocks to moving to a Docker Kubernetes environment in web hosting? So if you're talking about web hosting for others, like, are you a web hoster, or just, I think you're just meaning your own web stuff. I would say that the stumbling blocks are just the massive shift in learning Docker and then Kubernetes. Your developers need to know those tools as well as your operators. So the operators are going to need to know how to manage containers and deploy them. And if you're talking about you mentioned large organizations, so it's a massive training. So typically, like the teams that I work with, we start with training, and then we start with a pet project that we take one app and we containerize it. We get everyone to run containers locally and get it working locally, and then we get it on a server. We don't necessarily go like straight to Kubernetes. We delay that Kubernetes decision for months until people actually understand the concepts of Docker and they're running things, at least in some sort of staging capacity or testing capacity, just with Docker alone, because Kubernetes is its own huge ball of wax, and it's a lot of learning there. And to mix that in with also having to learn how containers work, that's a huge deal for a lot of people. So, 2 or 3 or 4 day training workshops multiple times, or quite often with companies that I work with, people taking my courses or other courses. I'd say that is it's time. Basically, that's the biggest challenge, is that there's probably a tool to solve every problem now in container land. There's 100,000 tools, but learning the different patterns and practices for Docker, I'd say, is the hard one there. Next quick question. I'm trying to do some rapid fire since we're a little bit behind on the questions. Is there a way to define pod dependencies in Kubernetes like you would do in your Docker Compose services? No. Next question. Need a real-world project CI/CD course to understand completely how to manage all the different programs together and not get lost in the middle of the work. Do you know of a good sample app that people can actually use with Semaphore as like a way to, if they're just needing to learn a CI tool? Is there something that you guys refer to or have?
Yeah, I'll just share my screen in a second to kind of show exactly where the people can look. So there is a organization on GitHub called Semaphore CI Demos, where we have a bunch of kind of demo projects in various kind of technology stacks and languages, with the idea of, so they're not exactly, well, they don't do much, but they typically include everything that a production grade app would need to have. So um, I don't know if it's a Ruby on Rails demo, it does include RSpec for unit functional testing and Cucumber for acceptance tests. So kind of the whole set of tools, not necessarily like a very comprehensive or elaborate code base itself, but one of the demos that we have is kind of specifically focused on that we also use in the book. Is It's it's a Node.js microservice that is backed by a database. So again, not exactly Nginx container that you're working with. Um, and there is a sample configuration for Semaphore kind of in there, and this is how it actually looks. In Semaphore, this is like the CI pipeline, which is then followed by delivery pipeline. So this is what from our kind of side, what I can recommend to start from.
So it looks like on the left there, okay, so I have a code repository, and I guess, based off of a webhook or something, right, on a commit, a certain branch, then this would do a Docker build of the image. Then it's performing all the different layers of testing, and then it's pushing it to presumably something like Docker Hub, right? A Docker image push is what that is.
Yeah. So maybe I can also touch upon. So previously, somebody asked about stumbling block. I think that depending on where you may be coming from, but if you're coming from like maybe using something like a platform and continuous deployment, Docker is actually gonna slow some things down for you in the pipeline. So Docker makes every language a compiled language, for example, and suddenly your pipeline involves physically a large artifact that you have to move around. So if you have a test suite, a comprehensive test suite that you trust, um, it needs to run for a certain number of minutes. Large systems have a test suite that if run sequentially would take maybe 2 hours to run. And so you need to typically you must parallelize your tests. And in a Docker-based delivery, kind of the problem that we faced as a CI kind of vendor in the early days of Docker, because Semaphore showed up, in 2012 before containers in Docker, was like, okay, people want to build an image once and then kind of fan out into some parallel jobs, like typically some parallel testing, right? And so they don't want to build a container like 8 times, from scratch. So for example, in this demo, like we have, some for demonstration purposes, static tests, integration tests, functional tests. So ideally, we would just build a container image once and reuse it in these 3 kind of parallel jobs with as little overhead as possible. So
Oh,
in the
sorry.
yeah.
Yeah, so those are in parallel, right? That's what that's indicating there.
Yeah. And so in kind of cloud-based CI/CD space, each of these things is typically running completely isolated from each other, starts from a fresh environment that's kind of torn down as soon as it's completed. So it's not like exactly you can just carry that container image into, as if it's on a local computer. So, the default solution is I'm going to build a Docker image, then I'm going to push it to, I don't know, ECR, for example. And then we're going to pull it in each kind of what you're doing by that. What that means is that you are making very expensive network, round trips that you also happen to pay for every time you run some parallel jobs. So for example, we as a CI/CD provider at one point decided to build an internal registry that our customers can use, so that if you're building an image, you don't have to push it to an external registry. Because in many cases, it's maybe your build will fail. You don't really need that image registry from which you deploy to production. So you would push that in this step and kind of pull it here, but it's kind of on the same infrastructure, so it's really fast. And unless you have some optimizations like that in place, Docker is just gonna add, minutes and minutes of overhead to your pipeline. So you kind of need to also worry about these things as you are transitioning.
All right. And so from there, do you have, as part of that example, does it have the deployment process?
Yes. Although I don't think the Kubernetes cluster is alive at the moment, so I'm just going to show it from a screenshot.
Sure. Yeah.
So the cool thing on Semaphore is that you can chain as many kind of each of these like gray rectangles is a pipeline that can be as kind of simple as complex as you need. So when you're modeling the delivery part of your pipeline, you can you're not limited by anything. So in here you have a kind of a basic canary deployment scenario. Also, there's a rollback pipeline and another. We call these promotions. So you progress through the pipeline by either automatically or manually triggering promotion. So by automatic, it may mean like if the master build has passed, for example, you might want to automatically deploy to staging. But you can have like, for example, a manual step to release to production. So that's kind of the idea. So Semaphore is, I've noticed maybe some questions. Semaphore having any plugins to integrate Kubernetes? Not at the moment. Semaphore is pretty agnostic. What you're doing, it is kind of something that we're definitely thinking about. So yeah, you can connect to anything, but there's no kind of in-app kind of wizard to kind of help you,
Right.
unless you download our book and reuse our examples.
Yeah. Let's see. We got a bunch more questions there. So we got to that one. So we got Rearwood project. Was it Kafka driven? We have a Kafka-driven backend, around 50 plus consumers and producers. Testing is pain, as there are so many topics and consumer producers. Is there a way to ease it? I know nothing about Kafka.
Yeah, we don't use Kafka, although Confluent is a customer. But I have maybe a personal story that's semi-related. So the way I kind of got hands-on into microservices, I kind of learned it from Fred George. He's a veteran in the industry, early kind of promoter of that architecture, and just a great guy actually. And there was kind of a workshop that I was at. He was kind of guiding us, and it was a couple of years ago. He was kind of, the way he worked at that time was just microservices, like very, very small microservices, almost like scripts, just being pushed as packaged in Docker, pushed. I don't know where they would run, but using Kafka as a kind of message bus. And yeah, he seemed like a big fan of Kafka back then, and the way if you would like the way he described it is like developer anarchy. So testing was actually not a big part of the kind of way of work. It was more about continuous deployment, instant deployment, but having a lot of monitoring and metrics in place to kind of alert you if something goes south. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We have a question on Kubernetes versus Rancher. Any thoughts? Everyone is obviously focusing on Kube, but sounds like Rancher is coming in between Swarm and Kube. Okay, so to clear up that confusion there, Rancher is Kubernetes. So if you're installing Rancher, it is a Kubernetes server. That it's just simply a distribution. So when you think about distributions of Linux, right, we have very few of us will actually ever build our own Linux system in terms of building our own kernel, then installing our own package manager, then installing all of our dependencies. Like that normally doesn't happen. People choose, CentOS, Ubuntu. All these things are distributions or flavors of that open source Linux ecosystem. And the same is true of Kubernetes now. Kubernetes, unlike Docker, which Docker you always get from Docker, the company, and it's just one product. Kubernetes is an open source ecosystem that you can either install vanilla, which means the upstream original open source, which I don't actually recommend unless you're planning on building out a hosting solution, like you're actually going to be a professional hoster and you need a really custom, and you have like 3 people that are Kubernetes experts. That's when I would do that. Otherwise, you're going to do something like Rancher, which is a distribution of Kubernetes that makes it easier to deploy and manage. Docker Enterprise, VMware, even NetApp has one. Like there's over 100 of them, distributions of Kubernetes. So I would say, your choices are really Kubernetes or Swarm. And if you go Kubernetes, you have to pick a distribution. So I think we got the plugins question, right? How to build multi-arch images with single Docker file that contains platform-specific steps. There are predefined args in BuildKit, but nothing in Docker build. Any suggestions? I would say I have never seen a team, unless it's just a Go binary that they're building, use the same Docker file for all platforms. So if you need a multi-platform set of images, every time I've seen it, it's always a separate Docker file per platform. So if you needed ARM and a AMD, then you have 2 Docker files, and it might be like Dockerfile Dockerfile.arm or Dockerfile, something like that. And then you're building to that specific platform, because it's pretty hard, especially the run commands are going to be different. So if you were trying to do it in a single Docker file, all it would end up being is a bunch of environment variables and arguments that you would have to define every one of them at build time, probably, or a lot of them. And you might be able to get away with it on certain things, like maybe if you environment variable the from image and you're doing something super basic like a Go build or maybe an npm install with Node, you might be able to get away with the same Docker file, and you just specify the build, the from image. So you would define from Alpine or from the default in Node.js, or if you have like a Node dash, I'm not sure what the name of the image is, but it's probably like, I can actually just look it up. But the Node image hub / Node, for example. So this one, you can see it has all these different architectures that supported. So it's got ARM, IBM Z, they're basically their mainframe, PowerPC. So if you search for ARM, you'll see that there are some specific images per platform, and you would change the from image in the first line. So that's the simplest, but most people's Docker files are not 5 lines. They're like 100 lines. So I don't know how you would do that. Owen mentioned slowing things down with Docker. Docker does not change the way your application runs, so it's not going to affect the speed of how the apps in your containers run. I mean, you can certainly restrict the resources if you want, but an application running in Docker is just a native application running on Linux. It just happens to be restricted in what it can see and access, really.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I wasn't clear. So when I was talking about something slowing down, I meant in the CI/CD pipeline.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, if you're adding extra steps like doing Docker builds, that's probably going to take more, add more time to your builds, right? That's what you were talking about. Versus running on a server where you're just running the app, it doesn't change. Good point. I'm glad that we cleared that up. Someone asked, okay, so we got someone asked about Semaphore security, but I'm not really sure about the specific topic of security because there's a lot of topics around security. So if you have a more specific question, it would be more helpful on exactly what you're asking for security. What are the ongoing future programs of Semaphore? Any R&D automation projects going on ops as well?
Yeah, if I just kind of generalize what's in store for the future. Well, definitely, like we're thinking about kind of ways of further kind of simplifying things and making CI/CD even more accessible, because our idea is that CI/CD should not be kind of ops centric, but more like every developer should be able to contribute, because if you just follow the principle of you own you build it, you run it, for example, that means you should be in control of your pipeline and be able to, if not set it up, then easily customize it. So one of the things that I can show you in a second what I mean. So Brad has shown has mentioned that there are a couple of typically different tools have different languages. Usually all major CI/CD solutions follow the idea of configuration as code. So in practice, you kind of end up with the task of writing, for example, a YAML file by scratch. We kind of don't like that. Like if you would put a gun to my head and ask me to write a Semaphore YAML file from scratch, I probably wouldn't be able to do it. Instead, we have, for example, a thing that we call a workflow builder. So that creates a YAML for you and actually saves it on GitHub. But you don't really write it yourself. You just kind of go and click around and add more steps. And you just kind of don't worry about the syntax. You kind of understand what you basically draw what you need to do.
Yeah, I like that.
So yeah.
And what does it produce?
So
it produces the YAML file. Oh, look at that! Is it showing like a diff?
Yeah, this is a diff comparing to what's on GitHub right now, and yeah, just kind of creates a new branch.
So it's funny that you're showing this because one of the things I have been whining about and requesting is, so many of these tools use Git as the there you have a configuration file, and it's just basically what you said, which I'm forced to either do things in a GUI or in YAML code, but I can't do both, right? It's kind of like if you've ever used CloudFormation to deploy something on AWS, you know that if you go in and change things in AWS after that, then it's going to probably screw up your configuration in YAML. So what I've really wanted this to get to is a point where we can use these tools from the GUI, and then it understands that there's a Git workflow behind changing those configurations. And it looks like that's what you're building here, is a way for it to reflect the changes that you. So if I don't want to have to go to the command line and edit YAML, I can still do it in the GUI, but I'm still doing infrastructure as code and change, all that stuff. So very cool.
Yeah. That's what we wanna do. So yeah, we're basically now thinking of ways of maybe simplifying this even further, and but a lot of people really love this because it's somehow I guess in the industry it's kind of assumed that if something is based on configuration files, that's you have to write them yourself and there's no other way. But actually, this is possible. So
Yeah, we talk about this year. We've been talking a lot about GitOps on this show, and I love all of the concepts of GitOps and like making Git the central source of truth for everything. So the more I see, our tooling adopting an assumption of I'm going to be using, like, the first step is I'm going to be using Git as that place for storing this stuff, and the fact that these tools are now adopting that is the step before we get to the actual GitOps workflow, which is maybe the next thing that happens after. But anyway, is that a feature that's in production now, or is that something you're working on, or what?
No, this has been in production for quite some time now.
Oh, okay. Because we were talking about the question was more about R&D and anything coming up. So I wasn't curious. I wasn't sure if that meant you.
Good point. Yeah, but everything that I've shown is in production today.
This is all real stuff.
Yes.
All right. So let's see. We've got a couple more questions, and we're running a little long, so we're gonna wrap this up. But I'm going to go in reverse order. Is there any my ZSH plugin that can be used to format Docker YAML files in Vim? So you would need a Vim plugin for that. So that's not related to your shell. So go look for Space Vim. Space Vim is a distribution of Vim that I use, and I really like it. Just search for Space Vim. That can help you. So we'll make this the last question. How does Semaphore compare to others? What are the main USPs? Does that stand for something that I don't know?
Unique selling points, I guess.
Yeah, that sounds like a marketing term.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously there's lots of tools out there, and it's the answer varies to some extent based on what you're comparing it with. A difference comparing to something like Jenkins, which you have to maintain and scale on your own, is huge. The difference comparing to other maybe cloud-based solutions, the most obvious one that you can experience pretty much right away is the Semaphore is the fastest, which makes it's a pretty big deal if you don't like kind of sitting around idle waiting for a CI to give you feedback. Faster as in like 2x to maybe 30% to the kind of closest competitor. So we kind of published a white paper if you're into that kind of stuff, which takes outcomes of some of our customers, a team of about a dozen people. This all kind of ends up saving a team of or over 500 hours per month. Just which people would spend kind of either doing nothing or context switching and not very productive.
Right.
We have also, not every kind of cloud-based service is actually serverless. So Semaphore is fully kind of pay-as-you-go thing, free for open source, free for small-scale private projects, hobby projects. So definitely easy to try it out. But if you're a kind of organization, there are no per-user fees, and you're not kind of capped by some capacity. So if you are, Thursday afternoons are the busiest, and when a lot of people push code, Semaphore is there to run it all immediately. Versus, it's you're not waiting for CI resources to become available. And yeah, there are other differences if you compare it to some specific tools, but this workflow builder is something that is also, as far as I know, something unique that makes the whole process hopefully more accessible to everyone in the company.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I like the visual nature of it for sure. And I think it's always tough, especially because if you ever looked at a Jenkins workflow when it's like 500 lines, it's just like it's really hard to understand what is this even doing. And understanding, and they have their own visualizations, but I think most of us are all looking at ways to get off of Jenkins. So anything that can make it easier to not have to run our own tool, and I know some people have that requirement, but it's a good thing. So
the reason, like one of the reasons, is that Semaphore was like a part of that early cohort of cloud-based CI services. We were all just doing CI in the first few years. Was that if you needed flexibility, like being able to define pipelines that fan out, have depends, workflows depend on each other and stuff, you were out of luck. Basically, we could not support you. So what has changed in the recently, at least for Semaphore, is that we think that if there's a workflow you need, any DevOps workflow, we can support it. So you get the full convenience of the cloud, and just don't worry about how CI/CD works. Focus on your actually creating stuff.
right, cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. We need to wrap it up because we're kind of a little bit over on time, but this is just internet time, so it doesn't. I don't know if that matters or not. But so I put some links in the chat for those of you that weren't looking at chat. So there's a link to get the free ebook that Marco keeps talking about. That's 90 pages of talking about how to get started with CI/CD, essentially. It's pretty. I downloaded it. So yeah, check that out, and then look up. Read that stuff about Git flow. That was actually a pretty good. I'm gonna put that link in chat because that's something that I did not know the origins of it, or its difference to GitHub flow. And he looks like the author Vincent actually updated it to reflect on 2020 instead of 2010, and he has some interesting comments about the fact that if you're in a what does he say? If this is not the class of software that basically, if your team is doing continuous delivery of software, I would suggest adopting a much simpler workflow like GitHub Flow instead of trying to shoehorn Git Flow into your team. So that's actually a pretty cool comment. So maybe looking into GitHub Flow, adopting that, and that sort of is how your code workflows are going to happen. But then when it comes to something like CI/CD, maybe look at the CI/CD guide from Semaphore, and that'll hopefully get you closer to your goal, to having a more automated and smooth process, faster process, especially for getting your code from your machine into servers. So, Marco, where can people reach out? You're on Twitter. We got our Twitter handles below us.
Yes. If you're watching this after the live stream is over, you have any questions, feel free. I'm happy to help. Hit me up with any questions on Twitter related to CI/CD and if you need any help with Docker and Kubernetes, you know where to find Brett.
Yeah. So yeah, reach out on Twitter. We tend to continue this conversation after every live show on Twitter, or in one of my chats now, Slack and Discord. I got so many places. So and we will be back here next week. I actually, you know what? We might be off next week. I think I'm taking vacation next Thursday. So it'll be one of the rare occasions that we're not live. But if you catch up on my Patreon page, if we're going to launch anything or do anything, you can see that there. That's where all the updates happen. And we will see you either next week or the week after here on YouTube Live on Thursdays. So thanks again, Marco. See you.
Thank you. This was fun.
Yeah. Glad to have you.